Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep, dynamic journey into one of the most famous pieces of literature ever written, Charlotte Bronté's Jane Eyre. But hey, we aren't just going to sit here and recap the plot. No way. We're going to look at this story for what it truly is, a relentless, deeply structured fight for personal autonomy. I mean, this is a story about a woman who absolutely refuses to be crushed by the world. She refuses to compromise her soul for love, security, or duty. Okay, let's dive right in. The bleak, isolated, natural aesthetic you're feeling here, it perfectly mirrors the atmospheric reality of Jane's early world. It's cold, it's lonely, and it is entirely unforgiving. But out of this incredibly dreary landscape, a fiercely independent spirit is going to emerge. And to really understand how Jane builds her independence piece by piece, we're shifting this explainer into our structured, highly visual style.
Think of this as our playbill. We're structuring this massive story into a highly digestible, 5-act dramatic arc. Act 1 is the forge. Act 2 is Thornfield's temptation. Act 3 brings the revelation. Act 4 is the Morehouse test. And finally, Act 5, return to equality.
Now, each of these 5 acts is intrinsically tied to a specific geographical location. Every single place Jane lives acts as a unique crucible. Gateshead and Lowood test her endurance. Thornfield tests her passions. And Morehouse, well, that tests her intellect and pride. Over time, each location violently tests a completely different part of Jane's soul, essentially forcing her to figure out exactly who she is.
So, let's start right at the cold, oppressive beginning. Act 1, the forge.
Jane's childhood is pretty much defined by systematic oppression and cruelty. As an orphan dependent at Gateshead, she's subjected to physical abuse by her spoiled cousin John Reed, who literally calls her a rat and throws heavy books at her head. And when she actually dares to defend herself, she's locked in the terrifying, supposedly haunted Red Room. Later on, she's shipped off to Lowood Institution, this dreary charity school run by the hypocritical Mr. Brocklehurst. There, she's publicly shamed, literally forced to stand on a stool, which she calls a pedestal of infamy, in front of the entire school. But here's the key takeaway for us. These agonizing moments weren't just trauma. They were the hammer blows that forged her resilient spirit.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer defiance in these words. This is 10-year-old Jane, a completely powerless, penniless orphan, screaming back at her abuser, John Reed. Even as a child, Jane's internal fire absolutely demanded self-respect. She's read her history books, you know? She knows what tyranny looks like, and she flat out refuses to quietly accept the role of a victim. She claims her own agency right then and there, setting the stage for the rest of her life.
Which brings us to her young adulthood. Act 2, Thornfield's temptation.
Jane takes a job as a governess at Thornfield Hall, where she meets the brooding master of the house, Mr. Rochester. But I gotta ask you this, what mystery broke out in Fire and Blood? Because while Jane and Rochester are deeply drawn to each other through their matching intellects and the shared sense of isolation, there's a dark, creeping dread hiding in the manor's third story.
Jane encounters this whole series of unexplained terrors. She hears a demonic, mocking laugh echoing through the halls. She wakes up to find Mr. Rochester's bed curtains deliberately set on fire. She actually has to save his life by throwing water on him. And later, a mysterious guest named Mr. Mason suffers a violent, bloody attack in the dead of night. Now, Jane is told these are just the actions of a troubled servant, Grace Poole, but the supernatural dread heavily contrasts with the blooming, passionate romance developing between Jane and Rochester. Seriously, something is very, very wrong here.
Let's move to and see how all this builds into our frantic climax. Act 3, the revelation.
Okay, so Mr. Rochester has finally proposed and Jane accepts. They're standing right there at the altar, about to be married, when a jarring interruption stops the wedding dead in its tracks. Solicitor Briggs steps out from the shadows of the church and declares an insuperable impediment to the marriage. The man Jane loves, the man she's literally about to marry, already has a living wife.
And this brilliantly illustrates the explosion of Rochester's secret. His facade crumbles completely. He drags the wedding party back to Thornfield, up to that mysterious third floor, and reveals Bertha Mason. He's visually framed as a man driven to the brink of madness by his own life, tied to a woman who has entirely lost her mind. Rochester pleads with Jane, explaining he was tricked into the marriage years ago in Jamaica, and he begs her to run away with him to France anyway.
Now this is where Jane's childhood forging truly pays off. Look at the immense thematic weight of this moment. Step 1. She refuses to become his mistress, recognizing that living as a dependent in a French villa without any legal or social standing would eventually destroy her soul. Step 2. She chooses moral self-respect over an overwhelming, suffocating passion, And step 3, she flees into the night, completely penniless, starving, and homeless. She chooses her own soul and moral autonomy. She'd rather die on the moors than sacrifice her freedom.
Which plunges us right into a cold, intellectual dread. Act 4, the Moor House Test. Starving and exhausted, Jane collapses and is eventually saved by the Rivers siblings. As she rebuilds her life, the zealously religious St. John Rivers proposes marriage, but it's the exact opposite of Rochester's proposal. St. John doesn't love her, he just sees her as a useful tool for a missionary trip to India. Think about the opposite dangers she's facing here. Rochester tempted her flesh and passion, which threatened her morality. But St. John, he tempts her pride and intellect, demanding loveless duty, which threatens her emotional truth. These are the dual threats she has to carefully navigate to maintain her agency. If she marries St. John, her inner fire will be extinguished completely.
But then, we get a massive twist of fate. Jane discovers the Rivers are actually her cousins, and she receives a letter from a solicitor revealing a massive inheritance from a deceased uncle, £5,000. So the crucial point is this. For the very first time in her entire life, Jane has the exact financial independence she needs to be truly free. She even splits the money equally with her cousins, securing all of their futures. She no longer needs a man, or anyone else for that matter, to survive.
Bringing us to the warm, resolved triumph of the final chapter, Act 5, Return to Equality.
Secure in her newfound independence, Jane finally rejects St. John's cold proposal. And then, suddenly, she hears a supernatural, psychic cry of her own name echoing across the moors. It's Mr. Rochester's voice. She rushes back to Thornfield Hall, only to find the playing field tragically leveled. Thornfield is just gone. Bertha Mason broke loose, set the great house ablaze, and jumped from the flaming roof to her death. Mr. Rochester, in a desperate attempt to save his servants and his mad wife, was crushed by a falling beam. He lost his sight and one of his hands. Now a physically broken man, he's retreated to a small, isolated woodland property called Ferndean Manor. The power dynamics that once made Jane a mere dependent have completely, totally shifted.
Jane finds him at Ferndean, and she delivers one of the most legendary mic-drop lines in all of literature. "Reader, I married him." But notice, she doesn't return to him as a poor, obscure governess. No, she returns as a financially independent woman, a social equal, making a free choice entirely on her own terms. Because Rochester is now blind and maimed, she isn't entirely reliant on him anymore. Actually, in many ways, he's reliant on her. They meet now as true equals, matching mind to mind and soul to soul.
Jane Eyre's journey from a battered, powerless child to an independent, wealthy, and fiercely autonomous woman is just an absolute masterclass in resilience. So I want to leave you with this thought-provoking question as we wrap up this explainer. What does true independence look like when you absolutely refuse to sacrifice your soul? Jane walked away from abuse, she walked away from overwhelming passion, and she walked away from religious guilt, all to find an answer that belonged solely to her. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep asking the big questions.